Hey, in this lecture, I'm going to mostly read an article on Bergson and Levinas. I'm going to read the first few pages of it, and then I will go on to comment on the themes, do some summary of the parts that I didn't read, and give my own thoughts on the article. The Concept of Substitution in Bergson and Levinas by Miguel, José, Paley. There is no doubt that Emmanuel Levinas was heavily influenced by Bergson's work. Levinas often mentions this fact, pointing to a deep personal admiration for Bergson and his thought, but also to regret at how quickly it had been forgotten. Levinas's direct engagement with Bergson is nevertheless limited. Compared to the almost hyperbolic declaration of influence and admiration, Levinas rarely takes the time to engage with Bergson in detail. Instead, most of the philosophical work is usually presented through a discussion of the phenomenology of Heidegger and Husserl. In many ways, Levinas was a phenomenologist at heart. But Levinas was no ordinary phenomenologist. By developing his own thought in contrast to that of Heidegger and Husserl, he advanced a series of themes and methods that moved him away from the traditional focus on appearance and essence that marked the phenomenology of his predecessors. Levinas is sometimes called a post-phenomenologist for this reason. His objects of study are often those things which hardly appear, phenomena that are obscure, hazy, and that resist thematization. Most notably, Levinas is a thinker of the other. In this way, he is a descendant of Bergson, a thinker for whom language and the intellect often obscure rather than reveal being. This mistrust in both language and thought is precisely evident in Levinas' later work, which is essentially articulated in otherwise than being or beyond essence, where Levinas develops various ideas that would depart in important ways from those framed in totality and infinity. This chapter examines the possible presence of Bergson's thinking in the idea of substitution, which Levinas says is the central notion of his later work. At the same time, the question is, in what sense, if any, is the idea of substitution operative in Bergson's own thought? The chapter first describes Levinas' general philosophical approach and then discusses its relation to Bergson's thinking. It then looks at how Bergson develops the idea of substitution in creative evolution and in his short essay, The Possible and the Real, so as to compare it to Levinas' own concept of substitution as it is explained in both Otherwise than Being as well in his shorter piece, Substitution. In the end, I argue that Bergson's own notion of substitution can be read as a forerunner of Levinas' later philosophy. In typical fashion, what Levinas did was transform the formal structure of Bergson's substitution by reading it as an encounter with the other, i.e. as a fundamentally ethical event. For Levinas, substitution will be the ethical event par excellence. First section, Ethics as First Philosophy. Throughout many drastic changes in both theme and style, Levinas' work was always concerned with accounting for the possibility of ethics. How is it, Levinas asks, that subjectivity can encounter the absolutely other? How is it that such an encounter is ethical? According to Levinas, were one to judge by the history of philosophy, this seemingly simple question has been answered. It is the thought of Heidegger and Husserl, the phenomenological method, is to blame for it. The idea of philosophy is eidetic method, as the practice of revealing being a priori eliminates otherness in the sameness of comprehension. As Levinas would say, these are philosophies of the same, a kind of thinking marked by comprehension and understanding, and conceptual equivalence. Once the other is determined in this way, it would no longer be other. Traditional moral philosophy was likewise unable to answer such a question because it always understood ethics and morality from the point of view of the acting subject. Whether it be in ethics of virtue, utilitarianism, or deontology, the ethical situation was always understood empirically, judged from the point of view of the acting party. Ethics as such, however, Levinas is keen to point out, has very little to do with actualization, calculation, and embodied reason. Ethics rather describes a relation with the other. It is a direct encounter that places the acting subject in question. The question of ethics is not, what shall I do, but rather, how is it that an other makes a claim on me? Why am I compelled to act in a certain way towards others? As such, ethics is best conceived as an affective, shocking, or even traumatic event. Levinas' philosophy variously attempts to describe the kind of subject that would suffer such an encounter. Levinas is not describing empirical events, but rather transcendental structures which are later outlined by concrete events. For all its seeming complexity, Levinas' goal is very humble. As he says in Substitution, having provided a model of subjectivity based on this titulary concept, it is, quote, through this that there can be pity, compassion, pardon, proximity in the world. Even the little there is, even the simple, after you, sir. This is why Levinas develops what he calls ethics as first philosophy. He explores how the other, as that which cannot be fully grasped, controlled, or possessed, plays a determining fundamental role for subjectivity. Levinas' task is often paradoxical in this way. How to speak of the otherness involved in the being of the self without being possessed by the self? These questions set Levinas apart from the tradition of phenomenology in particular. How does one speak of what one cannot comprehend? How to describe that which resists description and determination without yet lapsing into negative theology? In many ways, philosophy is beholden to a notion of enlightenment. From Plato to Descartes, it is the light of reason which liberates us from confusion and untruth. The Platonic clarity that lies outside the cave is not all that different from that which grants clarity and distinctness in Cartesian thought. Heidegger too speaks of light, the light of the phenomenality of phenomenon, the clearing of being in which being discloses itself, appears, and shows itself as what it is. In all of these examples, it is the light which provides and guarantees conceptual intelligibility. The form of the good in Plato, the sun, is what ultimately upholds the relation between all forms. Levinas objects to this privilege afforded to light and clarity. If the light is what guarantees understanding, it is also what removes otherness. For Levinas, clarity and comprehension are always achieved at a cost. This is not necessarily a problem in itself, for our being in the world often requires making this life our own. We need to work in and change the world in order to survive. When this type of thinking is applied indiscriminately, however, it makes sociality unintelligible. Moreover, a philosophy that is not attuned to this fact runs the risk of legitimizing unspeakable horrors. The drive for clarity and comprehension thus changes phenomena, removing their alterity and transforming them into something that fits our own categories of understanding. Speaking phenomenologically, Levinas claims that in this way, every phenomena is made into a noumena. Everything becomes the intentional correlate of an overly intellectual consciousness. The other is transformed by the totalizing gaze of the same. Ethics is relegated to mere morality, and intersubjectivity becomes an afterthought. Levinas' entire philosophy struggles against this tendency. To make ethics first philosophy means to study the other in its otherness without transforming it according to the exigencies of thought. The other is neither subsequent nor subservient to a more fundamental identity of consciousness. The other defines metaphysics as such, yet otherness resists comprehension. Levinas is a post-phenomenologist in this sense. He continues the tradition of Husserl's intentional analysis, but directs it to those phenomena which escape complete determination. He thus speaks of the night instead of day, of darkness, and of those things which escape the grasp of reason and of the light. Levinas is a thinker of the enigmatic, of obscurity, and of trace. Levinas first reflected in depth on the other in totality and infinity. Here he advanced some of the criticisms we just recounted while developing an alternative phenomenology based on the idea of interruption, transcendence, and the responsibility, among others. Against the totalizing tendencies of Heidegger's ontology and Husserl's phenomenology, Levinas favored a kind of metaphysical thinking that was open to the idea of infinity and transcendence. In that sense, he considered himself a Platonist, thinking of the good as beyond being. Totality and infinity develops a phenomenology of subjectivity and interruption. For Levinas, the subject first brings itself to be from an anonymous ilia, through an act he calls hypostasis. Arising out of the dark anonymity of being, the subject is initially defined in its subjectivity by the enjoyment of its communion with the elemental world. Subjectivity is at base affective rather than practical or intellectual. In particular, the subject is formed through enjoyment. Levinas refers to this subject of enjoyment as egoistic, a citizen of paradise, driven solely by the quasi-hedonistic pleasure of elemental desire. This egoism of the subject, however, wholly self-possessed and independent, is interrupted by the appearance of the face of the other. The other contests the sovereign privilege of the subject of enjoyment and calls it to responsibility. The face of the other appears not horizontally, but vertically. It comes to the subject from a place of height and sovereignty, which the subject cannot possess or fully determine. The subject of enjoyment must thus account for itself in the face of the other, appearance of the other. Traumatic as it may be, will, for Levinas, nevertheless open the door to the whole breadth of what is meant to be a human subject. It is through the coming of the other that responsibility, discourse, and sociability are born. Although Levinas would never abandon these general themes, and later, otherwise than being, would significantly re-examine the idea and structure of subjectivity, due in large part to the critique of Derrida put forward in Violence and Metaphysics, Levinas abandoned the thought of an initially egoic and closed subject of enjoyment in favor of a subject that, from the very beginning, or in fact, even before any conceivable beginning of subjectivity, is already haunted by otherness. With the introduction of the concept of substitution, the transcendence of the other becomes transcendence in immanence. And with this change, a whole series of new concepts are introduced to define the nature of subjectivity. The subject of otherwise than being is now determined by ideas such as anarchy, substitution, passivity, obsession, and the immemorial past. Section 2. Levinas and Bergson. Before directly exploring the relation between these concepts and Bergson's thought, it is important to provide first an overview of the general philosophical relation between the two thinkers, as that will set the stage for the interpretation of substitution and its related concepts. In a short, originally untitled piece of 1946, Levinas tells us that it was Bergson that freed philosophy from the grip of the inhuman science, typical of the late 18th and 19th century, and its notion of a dead, machinic time. With duration, the very idea of an inner life, and thus of freedom, was rehabilitated. In this way, Levinas says, Bergson revived philosophy. Levinas even considered Bergson one of the greatest thinkers in the history of philosophy, who, quote, sits in the company of spirits of the first order, in the eternal banquet of Plato, of Descartes, of Spinoza, and of Kant, end quote. In particular, Levinas saw in Bergson a connection to phenomenology, once stating that it was actually he, quote, who had made many of the essential positions of the masters of phenomenology possible, end quote. Levinas thus saw his own phenomenology as Bergsonian. By this, he meant a few things. First, Levinas saw a connection between his practice of phenomenology, understood as intentional analysis, and his understanding that for Bergson, quote, meaning cannot be separated from the access leading to it. The access is part of the meaning itself, end quote. For both Bergson and Levinas, the meaning of something is never removed from the corporeal and historical conditions of the unique organism confronting it. Secondly, for both Bergson and phenomenologists after him, understood that the scientific and technical understanding of the universe do not adequately represent the subject's essential encounter with the world. Although immensely helpful, quote, the scientific and technical vision, end quote, with which we see the world often dissimulate the working of subjectivity, misguiding the philosopher into the trappings of materialism and determinism. Above all, however, Levinas' admiration for Bergson was due to the latter's notion of duration. This explains why Levinas singled out his first book, Time and Free Will, as one of the 5 greatest works in the history of philosophy, including Plato's Phaedrus, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Hegel's Phenomenology, and Heidegger's Being and Time. The concept of duration in Bergson's first work develops 2 ideas which Levinas found of particular importance. Levinas sees in duration first the possibility for thinking genuine novelty, with the novel as what is not yet being essentially the other. This is important for Levinas because novelty as the thinking of the other provides an escape from totalizing systems such as Hegel, as he explains in The Old and the New. Hegelianism represents the peak of one kind of thinking in the history of Western philosophy. The phenomenology of spirit sought the identity of the same and the other by positing a consciousness that, quote, encompasses, accumulates, and organizes a system in an act of knowledge, end quote. Such is the culmination of Hegel's phenomenology, an absolute spirit that sublates all contradictions and thus stands at the end of history. Hegelianism represents, quote, the ontological supremacy of identity and of the concept of substance, end quote. Since for Hegel all otherness is only something yet to be assimilated by the act of an all-encompassing consciousness, then there can be no place for an ethics of alterity there, i.e., a genuine ethics that treats an encounter with an other that cannot be reduced to the same. Bergson offers Levinas a way out of such a system because duration, which Bergson describes as, quote, unceasing creation and uninterrupted upsurge of novelty, end quote, fractures the identity of being with itself that Hegel had described. As Levinas says, quote, it is important to underline the importance of Bergsonism for the entire problematic of contemporary philosophy. It is an essential stage of the movement which puts into question the confines of spirituality. In this new analysis of time, one can catch sight of something else than the anthropological peculiarity. With Bergsonism, one can think the human as the explosion of being in duration. The human world would be the original place of rupture and would have a metaphysical bearing. It would be the very advent of mind. Mind is no longer absolute knowledge as consciousness of self and equality to self, but the emergence of the new as duration, end quote. With the idea of duration, Bergson frees philosophy from the tyranny of identity. In duration, identity becomes change, and being in general is open to the other. Duration is also important for Levinas in that it proposes a view of subjectivity that is defined and determined by otherness from the very beginning. The Bergsonian subject does not precede duration as an Aristotelian substance underlying change. As qualitative flow, subjectivity is itself this constant change. This explains Bergson's epistemology with its contrasting methods of intuition and intellect. For Bergson, one cannot think of the self with the tools of mathematics or physics. Science concerns with relations of space. Characterized by their use of numbers, these sciences are essentially quantitative, whereas consciousness and life are qualitative phenomena. This will all become crucially important for the project of an ethics as first philosophy. In Bergson, we are given an understanding of selfhood that incorporates the other from the beginning. Thus, before the totalizing consciousness of Hegelianism, before the intellectualism of Husserl, and even before the phenomenological ontology of Heidegger, Bergson's subject is defined by its constant encounter with that which is not yet. Levinas underscores the importance of this idea, of an otherness in subjectivity that precedes and qualifies the modes of understanding and comprehension which other philosophies claim as fundamental. Quote, the anthropological upsurge of duration would delineate, before logic, the horizon of intelligibility. End quote. With his notion of duration understood as qualitative heterogeneity, Bergson thus opened the door for a conception of subjectivity and intelligibility which is defined by this encounter with the other. Levinas will also claim that intelligibility relies on the other. In calling ethics first philosophy, then, Levinas's phenomenology is doing more than simply talking about sociality and impersonal relations. Inspired by Bergson, the question of ethics is, for Levinas, also a question of the fundamental intelligibility of life. And as we can see now, intelligibility is not simply a matter of reason or of intellect. Just as for Bergson, our proper understanding of ourselves is not quantitative but qualitative, for Levinas, the very question of intelligibility is not one of reason, but of ethics. The second consequence of duration that interests Levinas regarding the implied impossibility of ever completely knowing another person, Time and Free Will argues that choice can never be understood abstractly, as the act of an agent weighing a variety of distinct options at a particular point in time. This is because in duration, the acts of consciousness are never isolated events, disconnected from the earlier unfolding of the individual's life. In duration, the free acts of consciousness represent the creative evolution of a long and complicated life. While duration implies novelty, then, it does not imply absolute spontaneity. Springing from the backdrop of one's past, free acts expose and develop one's character. As Bergson says, quote, free acts express and sum up the whole of our past history, end quote. In defining duration as a qualitative heterogeneity, Bergson further emphasized the absolute uniqueness for each psychic state, at least insofar as one can speak of separate psychic states at all. Each psychic state is a part of an individual duration, and as a part of that individual history, holds a unique quality of feeling, what Bergson calls its intensity. Intensity of feeling is always radically unique. Thus, according to Bergson, an act is not to be understood as the specific intellectual weighing of possible options in any one circumstance. Rather, an act expresses the unique character of a consciousness in duration, a consciousness which acts according to the qualitative self-feeling. Further, because entirely qualitative, the feeling of intensity is entirely unmediated. It cannot be represented symbolically without changing its structure. For Bergson, this all means that a full understanding of another person is impossible. The only recourse one could have, if one wished to completely know another, would be to go through the entirety of their experiences, to live their life just as they lived it, in doing the same things in the same places, times, and even with the same body, so as to bring about the same intensive experience. In effect, Bergson says that the problem that to understand another, one needs to substitute oneself for them completely. The problem, of course, would be that in such a hypothesis, the substitution would be complete to the point of identity, where there would be no difference between the person seeking to understand the other and the other themselves. The notion of duration thus implies a double transcendence in Bergson: the transcendence of the new from the old, and the transcendence of the same and the other. Against thinkers like Hegel, Levinas too would develop a theory of absolute exteriority between human subjects. For him, this kind of radical difference defines the very essence of metaphysics. Metaphysics is a desire for the other that one can never fully possess. This is exemplified by the impersonal relation. The absolute other is the other. He and I do not form a number. Over him I have no power. He escapes my grasp and my essential dimension. Also, like Bergson, Levinas mistrusts the possibility of understanding the other symbolically. Signs and language do institute a relation between the two terms, but one that is nevertheless marked by the impossibility of possession and comprehension. The relation between the same and the other is language, for language accomplishes a relation such that the terms are not limitroph within this relation, such that the other, despite the relation with the same, remains transcendent to the same. End quote. This mistrustful attitude towards language is a third important point to contrast between Levinas' philosophy and Time and Free Will. Beyond the unbreachable otherness between two subjects, both find a distance between language and being that requires seeking new forms of writing. For Bergson, this results in the repeated use of metaphor. For Levinas, it results in an extended treatment of the relationship between signs, language, and meaning. These similarities aside, Levinas was often critical of Bergson. For him, Bergson's philosophy was not radical enough when thinking of novelty, duration, and subjectivity. Levinas espoused a somewhat common phenomenological critique of Bergson, especially of the ideas developed in matter and memory onwards. Like Merleau-Ponty, Renaud Barbas, and others, Levinas objected to Bergson's overemphasis on evolutionary biology as explanation for the relation between the organism and the natural world. Bergson described the function of the embodied subject according to the needs of the species, stating, for instance, that perception was an eliminative process where the organism subtracted all those things from the world that had no vital relevance to it as a living organism. This trend continued in creative evolution, where Bergson would often take the perspective of the species instead of the individual consciousness. Similar to his critique of Heidegger, Levinas objected to this view of subjectivity so heavily based on biological utility. As Levinas said, Bergson's later philosophy came to an impersonal pantheism, which doesn't take sufficient account of the crispation of subjectivity. End quote. Secondly, Levinas ultimately objected to Bergson's view of duration, which he said did not allow for a sufficiently radical view of novelty. For him, Bergson's duration is too intimately joined with intuition, that is, with a method of thought that completely grasps its nature, even if it cannot subsequently symbolically express it. Thus, for all its positivities, Levinas says that the Bergsonian intuition ends up being much more the same as the Husserlian intellect for Heideggerian ontology. It is a kind of thought which pretends to completely grasp the new. At one time, Bergson himself says this, claiming that intuition provides absolute knowledge. Levinas asks, is not Bergsonian intuition as consciousness, confusion and coincidence, and thus an experience still rediscovering its standard in a worked-over alterity? Does intuition constitute the modality of thought within which the alterity of the new would explode, immaculate and untouched as alterity or absolute newness, the absolute itself? Does the thought that relates to the new allow it to maintain its novelty and to stand the wear and tear? Even though coextensive with consciousness, thought by itself is knowledge, grasp, and preoccupation with being. Interested, the alterity of the new is reduced to its being and invested in a noumena which is correlative to a noesis and cut to its measure. Would it not be necessary to put into question the identification of mind with the intellection of being, or with the ontology within which the philosophy which has been handed down to us lives? End quote. For all the positives in his thought, Levinas thinks that Bergson falls prey to a common philosophical error in his attempt to ground his knowledge of the new and of duration, he ends by overcoming the new by eliminating its alterity. Rather than intuition, Levinas says, quote, a thought would be necessary that would no longer be constituted in a relation linking the thinker to the thought, or in this thought, a relation without correlatives would be necessary, end quote. Levinas calls this thought dichotomy and explains it with reference to the Cartesian idea of the infinite. As in Descartes, dichotomy would be a thought with a structure that cannot be entirely thematized or grasped by the mind that has it. It is the idea of an otherness in thought that cannot be subsumed, but that is nevertheless there from the beginning. It is as if time was out of phase with itself, always coming up against the new as radically other. Such an ungraspable structure is required for the radical alterity that Levinas seeks. Unsurprisingly, the allusion to Descartes' infinite also brings with it an allusion to the idea of the good. Here, various Levinasian themes meet. Dichotomy, as a relation of alterity, does not possess and determine its object, is reminiscent of the metaphysical relation to transcendence. It describes a movement or desire of thought that is entirely one-sided, social, yet non-reciprocal. This kind of thinking is best thought of as a departure, as to God, adieu. Quote, we think that the idea of the infinite in me, or my relation to God, comes to me in the concreteness of my relation to the other person, in the sociality, which is my responsibility for the neighbor. It is as if the face of the other person, which straightway demands of me and obtains me, were the nod of the very intrigue of God's surpassing of the idea of God, and every idea where he would be aimed at, visible and known, where the infinite would be denied through thematization, in presence or representation. Finally, Levinas also takes issue with Bergson's emphasis on the continuity in duration. Bergson emphasized this idea both in defining duration itself as a continuity, but also by describing the virtuality in things like affect and perception. All the metaphors used to explain duration bear this out, from the musical melody to the image of the dancer whose every move prefigures the next. This is problematic for Levinas because, again, as with intuition, the emphasis on continuity diminishes the novelty of the new. For him, any such limitation, be it conceptual, intuitive, or in regard to the connection with the past, is unacceptable. Time as the relation with the other is thus not about limitation, but about infinity. As a relation with the other, time is without knowable end, the infinitely unknown and open. Quote, the Bergsonian conception of time adds something new to being, something absolutely new. But the newness of the springtimes that flower in the instant is already heavy with all the springtimes lived through. The profound work of time delivers from this past in a subject that breaks with his father. Time is the non-definiteness of the definite, an ever recommencing alterity of the accomplished, the ever of this recommencement. The work of time goes beyond the suppression of the definitive which the continuity of duration makes possible. There must be a rupture of continuity and continuation across this rupture. It is not finitude that constitutes the essence of time, as Heidegger thinks, but its infinity. The death sentence does not approach as an end of being, but as an unknown. The constitution of the interval that liberates being from the limitation of fate calls for death. The nothingness of the interval, a dead time, is the production of infinity. Resurrection constitutes the principal event of time. There is therefore no continuity in being. Time is discontinuous. In continuation, the instant meets its death and resurrection. Death and resurrection constitute time. But such a formal structure presupposes the relation of the I with the other. End quote. Levinas reiterates this final idea again and again, always emphasizing that the relation to novelty must never be construed as singularly subjective. So he says this about the continuity that characterizes Bergson's duration. Quote, anticipation of the future, the projection of the future, is but the present of the future, and not the authentic future. The future is what is not grasped. The other is the future. It seems to me impossible to speak of time in a subject alone, or to speak of a purely personal duration. End quote. With this, we can see the typical way Levinas reads and reinterprets Bergson. His procedure consists in taking the formal structure of a Bergsonian idea and, so to speak, ethically transforming it by introducing the idea of radical otherness into the concept's original framework. In this way, Levinas ends up with a series of new themes which can be further developed in original ways. So I'm not going to read the entire article, but it's quite good, and the final section has more to do with Levinas's late work, Otherwise Than Being, where Bergson's idea of substitution was the central theme for Levinas later. And substitution for Bergson is a metaphysical and epistemological question, and really we can find it across his entire philosophy. In Time and Free Will, it was scientists who substituted quantity for the lived experience of sensations and feelings. Psychological states, which he shows are duration. And then later in Creative Evolution and The Possible and the Real, he gets a new depth to this question when he relates it to the problems of nothingness, disorder, and sort of metaphysical negations. And the gist of it is that we never encounter in reality disorder or nothingness, but a relative disorder and nothingness which relates to our anticipations, our expectations. So when we encounter something other than what we expected, we find nothingness and disorder. But these are just perspectival, and they're not realities in themselves. And what we confront is still a something. So Bergson sees nothingness as a pseudo-problem in metaphysics. And it's a problem with an epistemological defect as well, since it makes us unable to understand novelty and becoming. So Bergson always places these critiques of nothingness and disorder within a metaphysical question regarding the possible and the virtual, and the pre-existence of certain possibilities in their realization in the future. You know, in a mechanical system, if it's turned off, there's a certain potential there that is predetermined and will play out in its own way. But life does not operate like a machine. And so the predetermination of an organic and living, evolving system is not predetermined. And therefore, it has a kind of energy that is like potential energy. Bergson will call it virtuality. That is radically pluripotential. It has potentials that go in unforeseeable directions and changes in duration, changes at every moment. The potentiality, the virtuality of every moment is new. So the author explains all that and then goes on to connect it to ideas in Levinas, saying all of these seemingly unrelated ideas figure in Levinas's critique of subjectivity. How can it be, he asks, that something like sacrifice is possible? What would compel a self-possessed, free subject to act generously, ethically? In Substitution, Levinas answers this question by contesting the idea of identity and subjectivity that seems to be the norm in Western thought. He calls this idea the subject as arche, or for itself. To this, Levinas contrasts a picture of subjectivity that is from the very beginning for another, a subject that is substituted for the other prior to having a self at all. The subject is in this way always responsible for the other. This is the subject of substitution, a subject which he deems anarchic. But by this, Levinas means to speak of a subject that is in a non-thematic relation with another, that is immanent prior to consciousness, yet indeterminable. Levinas uses the term obsession here to describe the type of relation, a way of being affected that can in no way be invested by spontaneity. The subject is affected without the source of the affection becoming a theme of representation. The condition of anarchy thus describes passivity prior but fundamental to consciousness. The author then goes on to unpack Levinas's idea of this anarchic subject, which is a subjectivity that arises prior to active consciousness and intentionality. So prior to our clear representing consciousness, there is this encounter with the other, and this encounter is neither comprehensible nor escapable. And here we can think back to Levinas's earlier ideas about insomnia and the inescapability of the plenitude of being. We cannot get out of being. It's the horizon that encompasses and therefore contains us. So this initial encounter with the other that is prior to consciousness is a sense of being a hostage, Levinas says, in extreme terms. We are a hostage to the other, but we are responsible to the other, and we are host of the other, playing on the ambiguity of guest, host, hostage. And in many ways, this reflects an idea that comes up in the two sources of morality and religion, with Bergson's notion of a prohibition, a first memory that is of an obstacle to our effort that is thwarted. So we have this spontaneous, instinctual movement in life, and at some point we encounter an obstacle, but this obstacle is not like physical obstacles, not something we have to climb over or lift. It is a moral obstacle called obligation, and it has this sense of authority, a kind of virtual force that comes from an invisible realm that we cannot see, but which reinforces a certain prohibition to our action. Here's Bergson in the Two Sources of Morality and Religion, the very first page. The remembrance of forbidden fruit is the earliest thing in the memory of each of us, as it is in that of mankind. We should notice this, were not the recollection overlaid by others which we are more inclined to dwell upon. What a childhood we should have had if we had been left to do as we pleased. We should have flitted about pleasure to pleasure. All of a sudden, an obstacle arose, neither visible nor tangible, a prohibition. Why did we obey? The question hardly occurred to us. We had formed the habit of deferring to our parents and teachers. All the same, we knew very well that it was because they were our parents, because they were our teachers. Therefore, in our eyes, their authority came less from themselves than from the status in relation to us. They occupied a certain station that was the source of the command, which had issued from some other quarter, would not have possessed the same weight. In other words, parents and teachers seemed to act by proxy. We did not fully realize this, but behind our parents and our teachers, we had an inkling of some enormous, or rather, some shadowy thing that exerted pressure on us through them. Later, we would say it was society. And Bergson goes on to say that it is obligation, that this first encounter with this shadowy force that is beyond our parents' action, but is this prohibition, and this force of society and otherness, and the memory of this encounter with obligation and otherness and exteriority, a demand placed on us or a relation that we cannot absolve ourselves from. This first memory is in all of us. It's a collective memory, and it's a collective memory of exteriority. And it's like what Levinas says in Totality and Infinity on page 201, the face opens the primordial discourse, whose first word is obligation, and which no interiority permits avoiding. This first memory, which is moral in the sense that it involves obligation, is also the origin and primordial possession that we have of a kind of natural religion, Bergson thinks. It seems to me that what Levinas is doing is making the two sources of morality and religion, that according to Bergson, into a single moment, which is the face, the encounter with the face. The encounter with the face encapsulates both sources of morality and religion for Bergson, and I guess you could say it reduces the tension of the duality, perhaps, to a single, I wouldn't say idea, it's the good beyond being, and the infinite. Levinas, of course, does have his dichotomy of sorts between totality and infinity, and this maps exactly with Bergson's view of closed and open. The encounter with the other as infinite also implies this open morality, this open religion, which is the encounter of God through the face of the other. And along with that, this alterity of the future, this infinite possibility of what is unfathomable and beyond our power. So yeah, I agree with the author that basically Levinas is rehashing Bergson's ideas, but is transforming them in this ethical dimension of the encounter with otherness, which is the idea of infinity, which is a feeling of obligation in society, as well as a feeling of presence to something beyond, something radically other and greater and unimaginably expansive beyond our being and reality. The article's quotations and references and scopes of expertise in some sense came more from the side of Levinas. I think a lot of work could still be done finding the threads in Bergson's work that are influencing certain themes and lines of thought in Levinas that have clear relation to Bergson. And I think the most obvious point of connection there would be the two sources of morality and religion, where this idea of open and closed, and this was left unexplored by the author.